I'm Tom DiChiara. I'm the Vice President of the Garrett Park Citizens Association. I am standing in tonight for our stalwart president, Alicia Bone, who is actually, she had an eye injury, so she is not allowed to be on screen for the next 24 hours. Otherwise, she would definitely be here running the show. But we have a great presentation for you tonight. This is the third in the Garrett Park Citizens Association's series on racial justice. And we have Garrett Park Town Archivist Claire McDonald, who's going to do a presentation tonight. And Claire, let me read your bio real quick here. Claire has been the Garrett Park Town Archivist since June 2019. In this role, she's responsible for preserving the town's historical documents and official records. She has a master's in library information sciences from the University of Maryland and public administration from Portland State University. When she's not at Garrett Park, she works as a contract archivist, assisting families and small organizations in preserving their historical records, photographs, and memorabilia. So before we get started, I'm just going to go over, we usually go over some brief ground rules beforehand. So I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. Claire, can you let me know if you see that? All right, perfect. We don't have too many people. It's not a crazy large number of people, so we should be pretty good on bandwidth. But to prevent people from having feedback, we only want to connect to audio one way through your computer or phone. If you, as Claire is giving her presentation, please stay muted unless you're the designated speaker. We discussed, and even though this says that we're going to do two Q&A sessions, I think we're going to wait till the end. If you have a question on something that you didn't understand, that you want clarification on, there's a hand-raising function on the right-hand side of, if you go to the little person icon on your screen when you hover over the video, and click on the thing that looks like a person, it'll bring up a participant list. And if you go by your name, there's a little hand, so you can raise your hand to ask a question. If there are bandwidth issues, which hopefully we won't have those, I'll just basically ask you guys to turn off your cameras for a little bit. This meeting will be recorded. It's actually being recorded already, so that if you want to go back and see it at any point, it'll be posted on the Garrett Park website. We'll do the Q&A session at the end. And the way that we'll take questions is you can do that hand raising thing and I will unmute you. I'll go through and unmute people to ask a question to Claire in person. Or if you have questions and you want to get them out to us as we're going, you can email theresekeating@aol.com here, or you can use the direct chat function. So that's, again, that's when you hover over the video, there's a little dialogue bubble, and that will allow you to send Therese your direct question, and then she can read it off to Claire at the end. And then if you have any technical issues, Stephen Welker, who's our treasurer, Therese is she is the treasurer, and Stephen is the secretary, and he'll be joining us shortly to act as technical support. But you can also direct chat me if you have any issues. Are there any questions before we get going?
Hey, Tommy, it's Steve. I'm here.
Hey, all right, great, Steve. Thanks. All right, and I'm going to turn things over to Claire.
Great, thank you, Tommy. I'm just going to take a second to share my screen. So I'll just do 1 second.
Okay, all good.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming out on your Monday nights to listen to this presentation. I really want to thank the Citizens Association for making this happen, and Mayor Kaki and Council Member Phil Schultz for supporting me on this. I titled the presentation Towards Understanding Garrett Park's Racial History because I really see this as an ongoing effort to learn and understand the town's history as it relates to Black Americans and people of color. So really my purpose, the focus for tonight is answering this question of how can the town archives support what you're doing to answer the call for racial healing and justice. And I'm hoping to solicit your ideas and suggestions for how we can support you in this important work. Your town archives, it's a tremendous resource. I've been spending the last year, learning about what you have in the town archives and learning about the town's history and getting to know residents. And it's a unique and tremendous resource in the community. And I think there's so much history, that we can learn from. And I'm stealing from an article I recently read that this whole idea of connecting the dots between the past and present can really help us see and hopefully better understand the origins of our current dialogue about race, white privilege, marginalized voices, racial healing, and racial equity. So, a little background if you're not familiar with the town archives. We have been in existence in our current structure since about 2009, although the function has been in existence much longer. We serve as both a historical archive, collecting the history of the town, but also a records management center, so supporting the town office. And we're responsible for collecting, preserving, and making available the history of Garrett Park, as well as the inactive official town records. We're located in Penn Place behind the post office, and the image you see is actually a picture of one of the walls in our archive. We're a very small space, but we make efficient use of that space. Currently, due to the pandemic, we're really open just for email, research inquiries, and by appointment visits. It's again, since it's a small space, it's very hard to do any type of social distancing in that space. We also, we're the ones who update the exhibit cabinet that's out in the post office lobby. So you may have seen we recently added an exhibit on women's suffrage, which this year is the 100th anniversary of. We also have a website, and I've been really working to update this site, especially with what's going on with COVID-19 and not having access to some public spaces. This is, you'll be hearing this a lot tonight. This is a work in progress. As I've been working to digitize a lot of the materials in our collection, and those that can be out in the public domain, I'm putting up on this site. So it's definitely a website to visit pretty frequently and see what updates. The address is up above, but it's also a site that you can access through the town website if you go to the Archives Committee page. So just a real quick overview of, in general, what we have in archives. And then this way, as I get more specifically into racial history, you'll understand some of the terminology I'm using. Essentially, we have 4 categories of information. One are the official town records, and these are the inactive records. So these are things like town ordinances, town council meeting minutes, financial records. They all come down to us. We've got donated materials such as personal papers and correspondence, meeting minutes, photographs, and other memorabilia from town residents, both past and present, as well as citizen organizations. These are generally original records collected or created by the donors. We also have an amazing collection of oral histories, and this has actually been one of my summer projects, is really organizing and making this collection a little more discoverable. Most of the oral histories are from the 1990s. They were done in coordination with various birthday parties the town has had. Some were done in the 1970s, and we have some that were done in the 2000s. And then in addition to that, we have research files. And I kind of call these my, catch-all research files. These are generally copied materials that have been collected, compiled, and created by archive staff and volunteers. So they're not necessarily primary source or original records, but they're certainly great ready reference type of information. Some census information, some materials that Montgomery history or the Historical Society has. And this information has been collected over years, and it's nice to have readily available. Most of our records are probably post 1930s to 1940s, but we actually do have some records that are dating back to 1896, prior to the town being incorporated. So I want to talk, obviously tonight it's really about talking about racial history. And I have to admit, this is kind of for a lack of a better term. I wasn't really quite sure how to describe what we have. When I use the term racial history in this context, I'm really kind of talking about residents' views, perspective, experiences, and actions as they relate to Black Americans and people of color. So it's what do we have in the archives related to this? A couple weeks ago, I sent out a research guide I had created, and this guide is also available on our website. And it's basically how to learn more about the town's racial history. It definitely has limitations, though, and I want to be really honest about that because it's a work in progress. This has really been our first effort to try to identify what we have and put that out there as information. The other limitations is I created it based on a search of our electronic catalog. So we have a collection management system we use in the archives. Volunteers and staff have done a wonderful job over the years of trying to catalog and get information in there. But not everything is cataloged. Not everything has been fully described. So when I go in to search, I'm not necessarily picking up everything that I would like to capture. And that's, one of those, again, work in progress that we're trying to update, use some standard terminology for searching. Plus the system itself, it's for those of us who are spoiled with Google, it's not the most user-friendly search function in our collections management system. So it's very clunky and you really have to do multiple searches to get what you want. More importantly, when I did this first round of identifying what do we have, I used terms that were specific to race. So for example, I did searches of African American or Black or desegregation or integration or segregation. So I used, I came up with a whole list of essentially key terms that I did a search of. And I came up with quite a bit. However, it really overlooks the significance of materials that don't include race-related terminology. And I'm going to repeat that because this is really significant. There are so many materials out there that you're not going to find explicit reference to race. So I think a great example is when we look at some of the early marketing advertisements that were out there in the 1890s for Garrett Park, when they were trying to attract investors and new homeowners, you're not going to see in those materials anything that is race-related terminology. You're not going to see something to the effect of whites only or no Black owners or things like that. Yet when you kind of read between the lines of some of that information, it's clear that they were looking for a certain group of people to come in and purchase land. And that was certainly not people of color. It was certainly not people of certain socioeconomic classes. So while there's no race-related terminology in that material, you could certainly argue that it did kind of set the tone for what kind of town did Garrett Park want to be. So I think that is a significant flaw with my research guide at this point. That's why I say this is definitely a work in progress. And it's one I consider the research guide to be a dynamic document that as I come across new materials, as I learn of new things, I will certainly be updating that guide. So what do we have? So with all those disclaimers I just gave you, here's what I've identified so far. I'll be really frank, it's pretty minimal. A lot of it is really anecdotal information, a document here or there. For the most part, everything is largely from a white perspective. It's the experience and perspectives of the town's white residents. And they generally fall into the categories of oral histories, archive collections, and research files. So I'm going to jump right in and talk about oral histories because I think this is probably the biggest collection of what we have. So in all, we have about 120 oral histories, and I've been working to reconcile and update that list to make sure I'm counting properly. At least 40 of them, I found some type of discussion related to race, and that could have been discussion about Black families or other people of color who lived in Garrett Park. It may have been somebody's experience participating in the civil rights movement. It could have been about perspectives and experience on school desegregation, or the Black men and women who worked as laborers or domestic help. So when I say that it had a discussion about race, it could have been any number of topics. What's on the research guide are only the oral histories that I have consent forms for. And that's kind of been an ongoing issue in archive world in general about consent for oral histories. And I am working to address that, and where I don't have consent forms to share an oral history, I'll be working to get that. Most of the oral history, the 40 oral histories I mentioned, the references on race-related issues are fairly brief. They don't always provide a lot of context. So sometimes you're kind of left guessing of, what really was somebody wanting to say. And also some of them do include racially offensive language and references. And so that is something to be aware of as people are reading oral histories. We don't edit for content. And so it's what's been said will be in the oral history. What I'd like to do right now is actually share a couple excerpts from oral histories. I think that really kind of brings it alive a bit. It gives you an example of the types of topics that are being discussed. It also kind of gives you the example of how we don't always have the full context when we're reading these oral histories. For those of you on the phone, I will read the excerpt. For those of you with video, you'll see the big block of narrative. So I apologize for that. So this first oral history, I have to minimize Tommy, he was in my screen. Here we go. This first oral history addresses the swimming pool integration and integration of Garrett Park in general. The oral history, I think, is from 1993. This gentleman says, "It was the first community swimming pool in Maryland, and it took years to battle through the idea. What we were battling through was the concept of integration. The pool has been a great success. The pool has been integrated. But the town is not a great success in terms of an integrated town. There's never been, I think, more than 2 Black families in this town, and I don't know about any Hispanics." This next oral history is the gentleman references racial discrimination when a Black family moved to Garrett Park Estates. And I think this occurred about the 1950s or 60s. And there may be some of you out in the audience who are more familiar when this occurred. The oral histories don't necessarily tell me this. But in this case, this gentleman says, "I had a big fight with the Catholic pastor over here because one of the townsmen, I don't know whether he would talk to you about it, but he owned a house in Garrett Park Estates. He sold it to a Black couple. He was a doctor, medical doctor, and she was a teacher in a county school. And a next-door neighbor who was a member of the parish started raising hell. And boy, it got sticky. And I went up to the pastor and I told him, I said, 'Preach, tell him that's wrong.' He didn't talk to me for a couple of weeks. The next excerpt is actually an oral history by the granddaughter of one of the town's earliest families, Jason and Harriet Deffendorf, or Diefendorf, I'm not quite sure the right pronunciation. And it reflects a resident's perception regarding Black domestic workers in town. And this would have been about the 19 teens or the 1920s, the time period that this person is referencing. Oh my gosh, my grandmother. But you don't see people doing things like that anymore. And of course, we had no prejudice at all. We didn't even when we came here, because when I was a little girl at the house we had help. They lived in, we maybe paid them $20 a week or something of that sort. So we were used to Black people. In fact, the people up in Michigan would prefer to have Black people, say from Maryland or Southern Pennsylvania or whatever it is. Then they would, the white ones, because we had one white one who tried to become too much a part of the family in the activities. As you can see, I mean, a lot of times these are people just, they're talking, as they go. So this is exactly how it got captured in an oral history. And then the last one I'm going to share, and this is also another perspective regarding the pool. In the 1950s and 60s, community pools and integration were hot button issues, not just in Garrett Park, but in counties around the country. So this issue is quite reflective of what was happening. In this case, the narrator is reporting on what happened when there was a push to integrate the pool, but also I'll give you what the ending was to this. So he says, at one point, the people who helped to run the pool had decided they wanted to bring in families from outside GP, poor families, to give them an opportunity to participate in the pool during the day when it wasn't being used very much. What they did was where normally Black, white families would come, so many white people, they would just allow as many in as possible. When a Black family came from Kengar, which was a Black enclave right off Connecticut Avenue, right around the corner in Kensington, when they came, the pool committee decided that each one of the Black kids had to be checked and scrubbed and cleaned, and he actually stops there. Later in his oral history, this gentleman went on to say that when enough people learned of this in the town, this practice of inspecting the children stopped. So I realize it's hard just with these 4 excerpts, to really kind of get a feel for, the oral histories as a whole, but I hope they provide a little bit of a glimpse into the types of topics and discussions that were had as part of the oral histories, again, dating back to the 1990s. So in addition to the oral histories, we do have other materials, and some are from collections that have been donated. Others are single documents or information that either came from the town office or they were found in the collections, but there's not necessarily a lot of other information that goes along with some of these documents to provide context and understanding of, how did some of these issues come about. And as you see them, I'll explain that a little further. So for example, we have this 1951 document. This is from our Garrett Park Elementary School collection. And this was a resolution by the Parent Teachers Association of Garrett Park to open membership to the PTA. What the Garrett Park PTA members had discovered is they had attended a meeting regarding Black schools in Montgomery County. And one of the things that really struck them was that there were no Black delegates at this meeting. That was what the topic was. And so one of the excerpts from this document, it's about 2 or 3 pages long, is that after doing their own research, the Garrett Park PTA became convinced that there were no Negro school in Montgomery County, or apparently in Maryland, is chartered by the Maryland State Congress of the PTA. And so they made the push that they felt that denying these parents and citizens an opportunity to participate in the work of the Maryland PTA was unsound in a democratic society. And so they wrote this resolution in about 1951 to push for. And keep in mind, too, that this was prior to the desegregation of schools. And so they were starting to have these conversations early on. Another item in our collection, and this is a new collection, the Thomas S. Wilson Baseball Collection. It was donated this year. And Thomas S. Wilson helped to found the Garrett Park Baseball Club. So the Nats, which we're all familiar with, was one of the teams that got started. But what a lot of people may not realize is that in 1956, a junior division team was also started in Garrett Park, and this was called the co-op team. And it was actually an integrated team. Initially, it included about 3 to 4 boys from Kengar, and one of the coaches, James Hopkins, was also a Black gentleman from Kengar. In 1957, the team was no longer affiliated with Garrett Park. However, Tom Wilson and James Hopkins continued to coach this team, and it was sponsored by the Wheaton Co-op for several years. And it continued to have a number of Garrett Park boys, a number of boys from Kengar, as well as other parts of Montgomery County, including Wheaton and Kensington, Silver Spring. So we have in this collection a couple of photographs and documentation and some correspondence related to the management of this team. Another collection we have is the Garrett Park Swimming Pool Association. And within that collection, we have a number of materials related to what was called the In the Swim program. And this was a program that was sponsored by a nonprofit with the idea of bringing children from the inner city, and primarily Black children, out to the suburbs to use community pools. And Garrett Park and Kensington were both approached, as well as other communities in Montgomery County. But there was strong opposition to the program by some town residents. And this is one of those examples where there's really, if I were to search using race-related language, I probably would not have come up with this collection. Yet when you read kind of in between the lines and look at the details, it certainly was a race-related issue. Those opposed to the program argued that allowing quote-unquote ghetto children to use the pool would reduce access to paying members and expose other children to a myriad of potential health issues, such as the transmission of TB, mumps, meningitis, colds, and a whole list of other. And if you see at the bottom of your screen, they sent out this letter, and one of the comments was, "Would you like your child to get TB this summer?" There was also a number of people in the town who supported the program. And so they too sent out materials trying to address what some of the concerns may have been. There were, in addition to the access issue and the health concerns, there were also concerns about discipline and supervision of the children. And so the 4 camp, they sent out a letter as well. In the end, the members of the Swimming Pool Association did vote to support this program, and they had children come out, I think, in at least 1968 and 1969. Those are the years we have. Then I mentioned that we have a lot of these kind of, oh, sorry. I mentioned that we have a lot of kind of just anecdotal, one document here or there. And so the next two slides are examples of that. I found March 1970 reference to this Committee Against Racism. And so what you're seeing on your screen right now is an article that was in the Bugle on March 16th, 1970, just announcing that this committee had been created and who some of the individuals on the committee were. It doesn't give me a whole lot more information, and it talks towards the end about they want to give the public exposure to the side of the militants and its approach to some of the questions posed in the committee's flyer. So I'm not sure when they say flyer if they're referring to this one, but this is dated March 20, or this was announcing a March 20th meeting on racism and repression, again in 1970. So we've got these records, but I don't really know what the backstory is related to these. We also have a program from the year 2000 Martin Luther King celebration at Town Hall, as well as a 2019 proclamation on racial healing. So again, these are kind of just one document here or there that we have in the collection. So the big question is, what don't we have? And it's a lot of different answers to this. So other than the few oral histories, and actually we have 40, so it's, but of the 40, only a few of those are from the perspectives of Black individuals or other people of color. And so we really don't have a lot from that perspective. We also know, looking at 1900 and 1910 census information, that we had Black men, women, and children who actually lived in town, and they primarily worked as day laborers, farm laborers, domestic servants. But other than the information that we have in the census, so name, possibly date of birth, where they were born, we really don't know much about these individuals, where they came from, where they wound up, because we also know from the 1920 and 1930 census that by that point they had pretty much moved out of town. I think, the guess on a lot of people's part is they may have moved over to Kengar. But, we really don't know much about some of the original Black men and women who lived in Garrett Park. And then there's a kind of intriguing gentleman by the name of Guy Johnson, and his name comes up in a couple of the oral histories as well as the census. He was a Black gentleman who lived in town for over 50 years with the Diefendorf family. And we know a little bit about him from the oral histories. He lived in the Diefendorf family home. He served in World War I, but that's about the extent of our knowledge, even though here's a resident who could probably be distinguished as, one of the longest living residents in Garrett Park. And then we have kind of this big question mark of, the classic, we don't know what we don't know, of what else in the history of Garrett Park as it relates to race, should we maybe have in the archives, but we're just not aware of it at this point. So going forward, and I've been giving this a lot of thought of what can we do in the town archives, to make it more inclusive, to invite new perspectives, and reflect the voices of underrepresented groups. And this is my start at a list, and it's certainly not comprehensive, but it was, starting to think about this question of, for example, I mentioned the 1900 and the 1910 census. Can we do some work to maybe better document the lives of Garrett Park's early Black residents? When you look at some of the census information, especially in the 1900s, and when you look at the years that some of these individuals were born, it's probably a pretty good guess that they were born into slavery. And, so to be able to tell that story. We've also identified oral histories in our collection that, or work to identify oral histories that reflect non-white residents. I do have a handful. As I mentioned, I'm still working on some consent issues, but we may also want to consider, do we collect oral histories from other residents or former residents? Also, this idea of researching is exploring the context of some of this anecdotal information. I gave the example of this 1970 Committee Against Racism. And I'm sure, again, there may be some of you out in the audience who you could fill me in and give me some details, but to provide that understanding of, did something, transpire for this to be created, or was it just, a continuation of, the civil rights movement and understanding, the town's role and wanting to, be aware of those issues. So, and then the other piece is, would it be beneficial to maybe collaborate with community leaders in Kengar if they're willing to research and document our shared history, and develop that further. And then, of course, at the end of this, I'm hoping any ideas you may have, because again, this is your town archives, and we want to support you with what's the information you'd like to see. Before I jump into my final slide about questions and that, I do want to highlight there are such wonderful resources in Montgomery County that, just locally, that I think it's important to be aware of. Montgomery History, and my disclaimer is I do some work with them, so I'm probably a little biased. But they've really been trying to expand, what they're offering, and, recognizing that, like a lot of archives and historical societies, the bulk of what they have has always been from the white perspective. And I think they're really trying to make an effort to change that. So if you go to their website, they've got a number of anti-racism resources that they've been adding to that list, and they've been inviting people to add to that list. They have online exhibitions. Their librarian, Sarah Headland, did an exhibition about a year ago on school desegregation. This week, she's actually doing some programs on lynching in Montgomery County. There are 3 cases we are aware of, and Sarah has been doing a lot of research to better understand those cases and to present that information. And then they also have a lot of records on some of the historical Black communities in Montgomery County, such as Scotland, a limited amount on Kengar. They have Tobytown. So it's a great resource. We also have the Sandy Springs Slave Museum. They have some limited online content. The Maryland State Archives has had a 20 or 30 plus year program called the Legacy of Slavery Project, in which what they're trying to do is create a huge database pulling from census records, runaway slave newspaper reports, manumission and certificate of freedom records, so that it's a searchable database to learn more about enslaved individuals as well as enslavers. So it's, if you haven't had a chance to visit that site. And then my all-time, one of my favorite tools as I'm trying to learn about an area in history is Chronicling America, which are the digital newspapers at the Library of Congress. And I use that quite a bit. So there's definitely resources out there. Right now it's a challenge because a lot of places are closed, due to the pandemic. But most of them are responding to email and, are able to provide some limited online access. And with that, I'm going to turn it over for questions and discussions. Again, I really appreciate you coming out this evening and listening to this, and I welcome your questions or suggestions for me, or ideas you may have of projects you'd like to undertake going forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Claire. That was really interesting to hear about everything that the archives has, and also just to hear those excerpts. Pretty incredible. So for the question and answer portion, if anybody has a question that wants to ask their question in person, there's that raise your hand function that we use. You can go over to the list of participants, which is the little person if you hover over your video, and then just right by your name, click that hand, and then I can call on you. But before that, Therese, did we have any questions that came in to you during the presentation?
No questions right now.
Okay.
They're either shy or sleeping.
Oh, I see one. Elizabeth, you're good to go.
Okay. Hi, Claire. Can you hear me?
Hi, Elizabeth.
I just wanted to mention, it's not really a question. I just wanted to mention that Ruby Gibson, who is one of the few people on the, I can't remember what it was, the anti-racism committee or something. She and her husband, John, and their two sons, one of whom was named Reggie, who was my contemporary, were one of the Black families in Garrett Park. And the Wells, the Effrises, Sid Effris and Ruth Wells and Ruby and John Gibson all lived in Shelley Court.
Okay.
It was a little group there. So.
And I've come across their name in oral history. Sadly, we don't have an oral history from them. We do have an oral history from, is it the Coblins? Coblin,
yeah.
Coblin, and that's the one I don't have a consent form, but and it appears Mrs. Coblin may have passed away.
Mm-hmm.
So if anybody knows how I might be able to reach that family, that's one oral history I would definitely like to be able to share, because that is a perspective of a Black couple who lived in town. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Sure. I'm sorry, I have it's chomping at the bit here for me to take them out.
That's okay.
Oh.
Claire, can you hear me, Claire?
Yes.
Malcolm.
Here we go. Hi, Malcolm.
Hi. So is there any archive or any other collection that Kengar has of its own?
I have not encountered that yet. Now, Kensington Historical Society has been essentially shut down since March. So it's possible they have some materials, and I've actually been in touch with them. I've also, as part of the baseball collection, I've been so intrigued by this integrated baseball team. I actually found the son and granddaughter of James Hopkins and have been corresponding with them. But they themselves, the town does not have its own historical society or archive. So that's a work in progress.
Is Kengar considered to be within the Kensington town limits, or is it part of Montgomery County at large?
Part of Montgomery County, right. And Montgomery history has a very small amount. They have a file, but it's a lot of it's not sourced. So I'm not really sure where everything is. One of the things I think a lot of historical societies need to work on is building trust with, Black and people of color, because, a lot of communities don't want to share their materials with a historical society that their main narrative is a white narrative. And so I think a lot of organizations are trying to work on building that trust.
It would be great, though, to just reach out to anybody who has sort of an institutional town memory.
Yes. Yes.
I just saw there is actually an interesting, maybe I'll try to circulate it. There's a Washington Post article about Ken Gar that I think was from the 90s.
Yeah, I have that actually, I think, in our collection. In fact,
Yeah.
that's how I was able to reach the son and daughter or granddaughter of James Hopkins, because one of the people interviewed had the name Hopkins. So on a whim,
Wow.
I contacted her. She's at NIH, and I said, "Any chance you're related?" And we had a wonderful Zoom call, the three of us. But no, it's that actually. The question about Kengar, I think, is really a great one to research, because, and I think might be a wonderful service to them as well if nobody is collecting this history, because I would hate
That's what
for
I was
that
thinking.
history to
It's
be
really
lost.
mutually beneficial. And
Yeah.
I didn't realize, so they were established in 1892. Kengar was given land for, I think it was 32 slave families. So the whole story is very interesting in terms of
Well, so what's interesting too is I'm hearing mixed
is that not a true?
reports. Well, no, it's you raise a really good question of I'm hearing mixed reports on that, because that's always been the narrative, that they were a community established by former enslaved people. However, the land was actually purchased by Henry Kopp, the same, one who purchased Garrett Park. And if you look at some of the advertisements for Kengar in the early to mid 1890s, they are very similar to the advertisements for Garrett Park. They were trying to get investors of, ideally Washington, D.C., government people who wanted to live near the train. And one of the histories I read on Kengar is that they said they actually did not have any Black owners of property until after 1903.
So I'm wondering, right, if
Yeah.
it's sort of like everybody was attracted to the other side of the creek, and
right.
And then things took their course. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be really fascinating to learn more on it. It's I'm just scratching the surface on that history. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll talk to you more about it.
Cool. Put you to work. Other questions or?
We had one in the chat. Ellie asked, could the churches that POC went to be a good source for information?
Sorry, so the churches that
POC went to be a good source for information.
What's TOC? Sorry.
POC. People of color.
Sorry. Okay. Yes, very possibly, because in Kengar, I believe both churches actually do date back to possibly the 1890s or at least the 1900s. So it's quite possible that if anybody is maintaining records or that there are some records, it would be at the church. That's a wonderful point.
Anybody on the phone that has a question?
So
right.
Can I put a question out there of as many of you are attending programs on racial justice and exploring reading and all of that, what are some things that the town archives might be able to do to support you in your efforts? I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that, of what would you like to see us doing to help you as you continue in this process.
We do have another question from Henry.
Okay.
She said, does the archives have an oral history from Solange Hanson, African-American member of the town council 2008 to 2010? If not, it could be interesting to try to contact her for her recollections and thoughts.
That name doesn't ring a bell, but I will look that up and see. And if not, yes, I will definitely add that to our list.
This is Lillian. I don't know if everybody can hear me. I
Yeah,
just want to
yes.
say, Claire, you're the bee's knees. We're so happy that we found you. This is, you're amazing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I love this work. Well, so I think everybody knows how to reach me. Oh, sorry. Oh, thanks, Khaki. So if there are other questions or ideas, or if there's a research project you'd like to take on and you'd like my support, please let me know. You've have my email address, you've got the website, and I'd love to hear from you. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Claire. This was great. You know, I look forward to checking some more stuff out myself. And yeah, this video will be posted to the town website sometime in the next couple days. If there's anybody that wants to check it out. And yeah, like Claire said, if you have any other questions, please follow up with one of us. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
And,
Good night, everybody.
we'll see you. Good night.
Okay. Have a good night.